Hello, welcome back to Kangaroo Pockets. This is Cecil, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about trans representation in video games. As queer rep in games begins to see some improvement, trans rep is still largely absent. Although most of us know that video game culture is not exactly known for its progressive ideals and open-minded community, the fact is that trans gamers and game developers still exist. We're still trying to make a place for ourselves in a community that often actively harms us. And in order to make it a better environment, we need to keep having these conversations about what we're doing right and what needs to be improved. Before we dive in, let's talk about coding. Coding is when a character is implied or suggested to have a certain identity, but is not explicitly stated as such. For example, in the show Steven Universe, even though the gems are not human and don't technically have races, characters like Garnet and Amethyst are coded to be characters of color through their designs and dialogue. So if the character doesn't technically fall under a label, why does coding matter? Well, it matters because all media has an audience. So even if Garnet, the character, never notices or cares that she's black, the audience will notice. And whether it's intended or not, the way Garnet's character enforces or subverts stereotypes for black people will have an effect on the audience. And of course, the same goes for queer or trans-coded characters. Sometimes it's not just a character's design or mannerisms that contribute to coding. It's also the way their storyline mirrors those of marginalized identities. Looking specifically at transcoding, characters who undergo some kind of rebirth or transformations can really resonate with trans players. Even characters who are not explicitly trans can have an impact, especially on an audience that's desperate for any form of representation, no matter how small. And when there's not much representation in the first place, every instance matters more. That's why we're going to talk about both canon and coded representation. Both are equally important pieces of the puzzle. Let's start with what's considered to be the first trans character to appear in a video game, Berto. Berto is a character from Mario who was first introduced in the Japanese game Yume Kouzo Tokidoki Panic. When this game was altered and released in the US as Super Mario Bros. 2 in 1988, this is how the manual described Berto, mistakenly listed here as Astro. He thinks he is a girl and he spits eggs from his mouth. He'd rather be called Berdetta. Obviously, this was not the best way to explain Berto's identity, but the intent is pretty clear. In more recent games, Berto is sometimes said to be of indeterminate gender, but is usually just referred to as female. Berto isn't the only trans character in the Mario series. In the original Japanese version of Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, Vivian is canonically a trans girl. She consistently uses female pronouns for herself, although other characters do not. In the English translation, Vivian is always referred to as she/her pronouns, likely to avoid hinting at her transness entirely. This illustrates two common ways media deals with trans identities, and neither are exactly ideal. Trans characters shouldn't be constantly misgendered, but that doesn't mean their transness should be completely erased. There are many ways to include an important part of someone's identity without disrespecting them at every turn. One good example can actually be found in another Nintendo game. In Pokemon X and Y, Beauty Nova is revealed to be a trans woman when she tells the player that she used to be a black belt. In Pokemon, black belts are an exclusively male trainer class, implying that Beauty Nova was once considered male. This is even more obvious in the original Japanese version, in which she actually also mentions the power of medical science. Although Beauty Nova is only a very minor character in the game, this kind of casual representation is important. It shows that people can be trans just because they are, and not because the story requires it. As of today, possibly the most respectfully written trans character in a AAA game is from BioWare's Dragon Age Inquisition. This game introduces Krem, a trans male side character who talks openly about his transness in the game.
In Kunadar, Krem would be an Akunathlak. That's what we call someone born one gender but living like another.
And Kunari don't treat those Akun people any differently than a real man.
They are real men, just like you are.
Krem's character was largely well received by the trans community, and the success didn't come without effort. In a blog post, BioWare writer Patrick Weeks talked about the process of writing Krem's scenes. On the writing side, I wrote Krem as best as I could. I then passed him to two friends in the genderqueer community, at which point they showed me where I was absolutely messing things up, and gave me constructive feedback on how to improve. This is a really important part of writing trans people, talking to people who actually know what it's like. Many of the mistakes made when writing trans people aren't intended to be malicious, but they absolutely are avoidable, and writers need to make a conscious effort to avoid them. Let's take a break from canon representation and look at some trans-coded characters that emerged around this time. In Act 3 of Kentucky Route Zero, you meet Junebug and Johnny, two robot musicians who have escaped from their intended jobs to live freely. Junebug explains to the protagonist that when she and Johnny listened to an old tape, they knew they weren't minors. Her next lines will ring true for many trans people beginning their transition. We slipped out onto the road, just these two featureless shadows, and ever since that night we've been detailing, coloring in, specifying. I feel more like myself every day. This narrative of escaping an assigned role to become yourself is one that's intensely familiar to many trans people. And even though it doesn't negate the lack of trans rep, it does mean a lot to have a character who shares these kinds of experiences. A similar situation is found in Undertale through the character of Mettaton. In canon, Mettaton was originally a ghost, but became corporeal when Alphys designed him a body. In his diary entries as a ghost, he's initially unconvinced that he could ever have the body he wants. He changes his mind when he sees Alphys' sketches, saying, "In a form like that, I could finally feel like myself." Although all ghosts in the Undertale universe are referred to with they-them pronouns, Mettaton uses he-him pronouns after becoming a robot. Again, this is an example of a character whose experience runs parallel to those of trans people. Mettaton changes his physical appearance until he feels at home in his own body, something many trans people also experience when transitioning. Going back to canon representation, a 2016 DLC for Baldur's Gate called Siege of Dragonspear included a trans woman named Magena as a side character. This received a disproportionate amount of backlash from players claiming that the developers were forcing their politics onto their players. This is unfortunately a pretty common response to media that includes trans people, and implies that merely acknowledging the existence of trans people is an inherently political move. The backlash seems even more ridiculous when considering that Magena doesn't just randomly shout to the player that she's trans. You have to ask about her name, and then ask what was wrong with her birth name to even get this dialogue in the first place. Fortunately, Beamdog didn't back down after the harassment, instead promising to improve Magena by further developing her character. So as we discussed earlier, BioWare did a great job with including a trans character in Dragon Age Inquisition. Unfortunately, they didn't quite live up to that standard with the Mass Effect Andromeda. This game introduced Hanley Abrams, a trans woman who, for some reason, tells you her dead name right after you meet her.
What brought you out here to Andromeda?
Back home, I was filling test tubes in some dead-end lab. People knew me as Stefan, but that was never who I was.
Both trans and cis players alike understandably found this a little odd, as many trans people are extremely uncomfortable with their birth name and choose not to share it even with their closest friends. It's rare for someone to come out as trans to a stranger, much less immediately give them such personal information. BioWare did respond to the criticism and changed the dialogue so that Hanley only divulges this info if the player gains her trust. But the fact that no one on the development team stopped this from happening in the first place is a reminder of how desperately we need more trans people in game development. Later in 2017, the highly anticipated sequel to Outlast was released, and with it came a huge step back for trans rep. Outlast 2 features a character named Val as one of the main villains. Although her gender has been debated by players, her feminine appearance, female voice actor, and use of male pronouns by their characters suggests that she is meant to be a trans woman. The use of the LGBT villain trope is enough to raise concern, but even more disturbing is that Val is portrayed as a shameless sexual predator who rapes the main character and has sexual fantasies about murdering children. Although some will argue that this is a horror game and Val is just a villain that happens to be trans, the long history of LGBT villains in media suggests that this is a symptom of a larger problem. It's not that there can never be any LGBT villains in any media ever, but when the majority of trans and queer representation is negative, it's a sign that we need to do better. To end on a positive note, let's talk about another game released in 2017. Dream Daddy, a dad dating simulator, is exactly what it sounds like, and it was a milestone for LGBT representation. The cast of dateable dads is diverse in many ways, and one of them is canonically trans. Damien is a fleshed out character with his own storyline that doesn't revolve around his gender identity, but doesn't ignore it either. Additionally, when customizing the main character, you are able to play as a trans man by selecting one of the binder options. Of course, this is just the beginning of good representation, and we have a long way to go. But while criticizing the things that need improvement, we can still celebrate the small victories, and hope for bigger ones in the future. Thanks for watching.